everyone, and welcome to ProgressiveChristianity.org. This is our second panel on things that matter. The topic today, of course, is eco-spirituality, intersection of faith and climate justice. As you had 2 weeks ago, as you already had heard, we had subject matter experts who came and spoke to us on climate justice. And today, it is wonderful to welcome Mark, Caleb, and to this panel, which is going to be our board members, speaking about biblical texts and how we see the intersection of eco-spirituality and what do we do with the text that we have. So, having said that, without further ado, welcome Mark and Caleb, the board members of ProgressiveChristianity.org. And the first question that I have, it's going to be more of a conversation, not a question. But what texts come to your mind when we think about climate change or eco-spirituality? The first text that comes to my mind, of course, is Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground." That's one of the first texts. And I think Matthew Fox also talked about Genesis in his episode. So let's take it from there. What do we do with texts like this and our topic for today?
Yeah, well, I think, this is obviously the go-to text. Unfortunately, in a lot of ways, it's the go-to text. If you want to say that there's sides in this, it's the go-to text for both sides in a lot of ways, because the interpretation that we just read is just one of the interpretations, probably one of the more popular ones over the year. Instead of saying that so that they may rule over the fish, it says so that they may have dominion over. And I think too frequently we think of dominion associating with dominate, rather than some kind of benevolent rulership or anything like that. I think we have to pair this with the second creation story. So we've got two creation stories, and you need to have both to try to understand what the larger biblical perspective on it is. And so if there is question about 1:26 and what dominion might or might not supposed to mean, Genesis, the second creation story, Genesis 2:15, basically says that we're supposed to take care of this environment and should give us a perspective on that. So I think you've got the right text right off the bat. This is the one that tells us exactly that this isn't a abuse of or abusing of environment as much as a responsibility to take care of. I mean, that's my take anyway.
Yeah,
I think that's a great point, Mark. And I think we see these opening lines of the Bible so often misinterpreted. People don't recognize that this is designed to tell us why the world is the way it is, right? It's not supposed to be a bio textbook that's going to tell us how human life actually was created. But no, it's not designed to tell us about that. It's designed to explain why the world is the way it is. And so I think that if we're looking at this connection between humanity and nature, that we see from the very beginning, and we recognize that the authors of the biblical text are trying to tell us that we're mutually dependent on each other, that's really powerful. And Matthew Fox a couple weeks ago talked about his notion of original blessing. That God looks out in the first creation story, and after each piece is created, God declares this is good. And so instead of focusing on Augustine's creation of original sin,
right,
we're talking about this original blessing, all of it, and calls it good. And so, I love this, but with the caveat that you said, Mark, that we're not talking about dominion over the earth. And I think that there have been so many Christians that think that we can oppress the earth for that reason, because of this kind of misinterpretation of what this is supposed to mean. And not only that we can oppress the earth, that we can have dominion over the earth, but in some ways that we have an obligation to hasten the end times. And so that's the most troubling things for me is to hear Christians talk about trying to hasten the end times by destroying the earth so that Jesus has no choice but to come riding in on those clouds. And that is the worst theology that I can ever imagine.
Absolutely. And it's bad theology, because if we ruin it, there won't be any clouds to ride in on.
Right.
That's a good point, Mark. Trumpets might be sounding, but you're not riding in on any clouds because they're gone.
I mean, and just to kind of push that point even further, I mean, the idea of taking dominion over the earth, as if to say that if we go with that kind of a reading, rule over or taking dominion over, and not expect the earth or the creation to fight back and to resist, which is happening as we speak with the hurricanes and and the glaciers melting. So there is a sense that even this the ideology of dominion is this active passive binary, with the earth being passive, female, acted upon, with no agency to push back. And if we see anything from what is happening around us today, earth is pushing back, the creation is pushing back, because it's enough is enough. So there you have the text, which is really creating this kind of hierarchy, and then you have real life where there is a pushback to the text in and of itself.
Absolutely. I think that is an incredible point. And it plays off of, Dr. Fox's talking about the goodness of creation and the connectedness that we need to feel that this text points to. As you pointed out, the concept of dominion is the opposite really of connectedness. It's that you're somehow that you have ownership over, and that you can dominate something, rather than recognizing that there is this great connectedness and oneness between humanity and creation, rather than a ruling over. I wonder though, what is it? Why have we gotten to the point that we don't feel that connectedness to creation like we used to? I think that's a really important question to understand why we even would be willing to read these texts in a way that have dominion over.
That's a great point, Mark. I think one of the reasons is that we're continually disconnected from the land. We can go to the supermarket and buy food, and we don't have to even think about like where that food comes from or the process for that food to get into our hands. Like we're disconnected in a way that is easy for us to kind of forget about how dependent we actually are on this earth to survive. And I think we have the greatest human sin maybe is thinking that we're God, right? That we're in control of all these things in our lives, and that that we're not dependent on others or on the land. And so I think this kind of increasing disconnection from the land is one of the reasons why we can see ourselves as not being dependent. Whereas the people in the Bible, right, were at a time when they were literally dependent on the land. So Jesus goes around as this itinerant preacher, right? And most of his parables are parables that are, nature dependent. Because people, right, because people understood, and they're like, oh yeah, I get that, because I go out and I sow seeds, and I get that. A lot of us don't have that experience anymore. We're living in urban areas, many of us, and there's 50%, you may not be around nature.
50% of our population now live in cities.
Yeah.
In the world. I mean, that is remarkable, and I think gets to your point.
Yeah, I think you're exactly. A class in seminary years ago on different faith traditions and kind of their history with environmentalism, and that was one of the issues that we saw over and over again, was this increasing urbanization that made it so people just did not spend time in nature or with real like living objects other than people. It was mostly concrete jungle kind of stuff.
Right. And also to add to that point, the disconnectedness is there, but those kinds of feeling disconnected is also about supremacy, right? Which we
Yeah.
actually we talked about, white Christian nationalism a few episodes ago, and that is also connected to this idea of supremacy, which shows up in this text, especially if you read it from the point of dominion. So if you're thinking of ruling over, whether it's earth or a group of people or women, or the marginalized in any way, it is important in order to rule over to dehumanize them, right? And
Hmm.
dehumanize it, and be disconnected from it, because then it is easier then to exploit, which
Yeah.
is often what happens in colonial, and has also happened in slavery context, right? So here it is, which is why I talk about, which is why I think it's important for us to talk about the earth pushing back, but
Hmm.
having agency. One of the biggest mistakes we make is we talk about, you know earth as being acted upon, but not as the earth pushing back or having agency or having even a voice.
Yeah.
And she is, right, she is pushing back,
Hmm.
and reminding us that in the end, when the hurricanes come, the ultimate power lies somewhere else, right? So
Yeah.
that kind of disconnectedness has a lot to do with the way I think humankind has come to
Yeah.
think of itself in a very arrogant way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think for me, it points back to, a lot of indigenous religions
yes,
have very much still have this deep sense of connection with creation. And you talk about how the language used in a lot of those indigenous religions, you have a language of seeing animals as your brother or sister,
right,
as even seeing flowing water as your relative.
yeah,
And so there's this deep, like, not just connectedness, but this like partnership, this full, like, we are one, we are from the
yeah,
same lineage, essentially. And that's really powerful. And I feel like over time, most definitely, I mean, Christianity has continued to stray further and further away from that. And to Caleb's earlier point, obviously, Jesus was more from a perspective of feeling that connectedness
yeah.
and taught from it. And I think it's a real harm that we're doing to ourselves, that we continue to march away from that as a movement.
Right. I
I
mean,
think
it also makes me think a little bit of, when you say we Christianity has moved away, but
Mm.
but the text that we're relying on
Right.
is a reminder of the interconnectedness. Like, how
Yeah.
ironic is that, right? Sorry, Caleb, you were saying.
no, my point's related to yours, Sharon. I think that this gets into how it is that we understand God, and I think
Mm.
that one of the things that we have done is to make God this old guy in the sky.
Yeah,
And if
White.
we're
Don't
thinking
forget it.
about
Don't forget. He's white. Don't you forgot.
and has
he's white, yes, old white
beard.
guy. He's got a beard,
And a beer.
white robes, yeah, all of those things. Usually shaking a finger at you.
So, yeah,
What are you doing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got this notion of this deity in the sky, and we've lost the sense of interconnectedness. And so I think one of the fundamental problems is the way that we're defining God. If
Mm.
if we were to think about, like, say, Barbara Brown Taylor's thought about God as this luminous web of all creation, right?
Yeah.
This thing that connects all of us, that is this force, and so that when there is something that happens at one point in the web, there are reverberations throughout
yes,
the web that affect other people. Well, that has a direct link with all the things we do. If we're talking about things like the way we treat other people, right? If we do harm to other people, there are reverberations, negative reverberations throughout the web. Or if there are positive things that we do, there are positive
yeah,
reverberations.
yeah,
Or
Mhm.
climate change, right? So if
yeah,
we're burning more fossil fuels, there are reverberations
yes,
throughout that luminous web, that the source of divine beyond us is affected by the things that we do and we put out. So I think one of the problems is that we're understanding God in an unhelpful way that
yeah,
encourages us to
Yeah.
kind of not have the behaviors that think about how our actions are affecting other people.
yeah, yeah. the
Yeah,
detachment, right? The detachment of, God up in the sky, and then, God as the one who floats on the clouds, as Mark, who come in and rescue us. It's I think it's this idea of creating a savior
Mm,
who has to come from the outside to fix our
Mm,
problems, and that's always
sure.
been an
mm,
issue with Western, take Western
Mhm.
literature, Western theology, as opposed to sometimes, looking at things from an Eastern perspective, where, the savior figure is often someone who rises from within the community.
Mhm.
mm.
You're not waiting for someone to come from the outside to fix the problem, right?
Right.
So
And even biblically, we should recognize that. I mean, the text that we use as Christians during Christmas out of the Old Testament, so we shouldn't be doing anyway. But the
yeah,
ones that we think point to Jesus is actually pointing to someone that was already there within the tribes
yes,
that was
yes,
going to rise up and do this for them.
yes,
You would
yes,
think that to me, a lot of this has to do with as the Western world bought deeper and deeper into industrialization. We
right.
removed ourselves more and more from the idea of being connected with anything and being, like I did this myself and this very individual ruggedness.
Mm.
And even the way we now think and teach, we
Mhm.
forget about connectedness. For instance, I am an anti-Trinity kind of person. I
Yeah.
don't see anything biblical about it. I don't know that it's very helpful. But just think about the way we teach the Trinity. The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. And we talk about them individually. The one
Yes,
thing that's actually rescued the concept of Trinity for me is what if we started talking about not that God is three in one, but that God is the connectedness of all these
of the
things.
three.
That
Yeah,
there we don't tend to even think about going in those places, even as we have these perfect examples almost of this is a great way to communicate the importance, the essentialness of being connected to all that we are, including
yeah.
the creation and our connection there as well.
I love that thought, Mark. I'm not Trinitarian either, as you know, and so I love any kind of saving of that or
Right.
making any kind of sense of that for me. I need all
Right.
the help I can get. And so, since I'm
Yeah,
not
same.
Trinitarian, that I tend to think of Jesus as our best teacher about how we know God. Like John
Hmm.
Dominic Crossan said, if you want to know what
Absolutely.
God looks like in sandals, you point to
Yes,
Jesus, right?
yes,
And
Right.
so, Sharon, your point about someone being rising up in the community, and
Hmm.
Mark, you talking about that in the Old Testament, like that's kind of how I view Jesus, right? And
right.
I think that this gets into like the problematic notions of Jesus coming to save us, as you mentioned,
Yeah,
that if we're viewing Jesus as someone who rose up from within his community and was a leader, a faith leader who taught people about how it is that we are to live our lives, that
Hmm.
if we in churches, I think, begin to talk more about Jesus
yes,
like that, I think that's one of the ways that we begin to address a lot of issues, but particularly things like climate change, because then no longer are we waiting for Christ to come and save this world for us, but it is then incumbent to rise up in our
Hmm.
communities and to begin taking
yeah,
action for to address climate change in the here and now.
Yeah,
yeah.
I love that.
And I think, the Gospel of John is notorious for that too, because of the way, the prologue even begins.
Yeah, in the
God sent
beginning.
God's Son. It's this idea of like the coming down, as opposed
Hmm.
to, the rising up, right? And it's important for us to
Ah, mm,
make that shift. And as I was just even thinking, I mean, if we think about, Jesus as a leader, who is he? I mean, he is a Jewish man who was born, in his own community, right? And he is leading his community through a particular transition. And that's so important for us to even think of it that way.
Mm.
And the fact that we don't, and we think of him as some kind of alien who just shows up and fixes our problem, right? No,
Right.
he isn't. Like, we have to imagine his humanity, and there is a hesitancy to imagine him in
Mm.
in in his humanity. That I've seen. Um, talking about coming from the heaven. Let's go to another text. So
Yeah.
we're kind of jumping around, right? So Revelation
Sure.
21. Like, let's go straight to the end, right? let's go straight to
Go
the
for it.
yeah, so Revelation 21 is one of the other texts that is often used as this kind of escapist literature. And then here you have in Revelation 21 where it says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God.'" I apologize for the masculine language here. Uh, but that's the language here. So
That's the text, yeah.
Right.
yeah, he will wipe every tear from their eye. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, from the old order of things has passed away. Right. So what do y'all think about, again, Revelation? And I had told y'all I'm kind of biased to it because it is one of my favorite texts. Probably do, right? But one of the things about this text that I find, is that it often gets misinterpreted, just like so many things in the Bible does. But it's the sense of, it's asking us to have this escapist kind of ideology where let's not really worry about what is happening right now, because ultimately in the end we're just all going to climb up on that cloud and float away, right, to where we don't know yet. But it's this sense. What do y'all think about this text?
Caleb, you want to go?
Sure. So I think Revelation, I think, is interesting because a lot of people want to use this exactly in the way that you were talking about, Sharon. They want to use it as kind of this predictor of end times, and then we get this terrible theology about the rapture and stuff that it was was just recently invented. And so I think, though, if we look at Revelation in its original context, it gives us a lot of helpful insight, right? So if we know that John of Patmos was on that island because being persecuted, and he couldn't write directly about the Romans because he would be persecuted himself. If we recognize that and can see the book of Revelation as kind of code for what was going on in the Roman Empire, wow, that takes on a whole new meaning, because then we get someone who's living under the thumb of Roman oppression, who's talking about how his people are being slaughtered by the Romans. And I think that gives us really some intense insight into what life can be like if it's hard. And I think there's also, it makes the longing for something else to be completely understandable, right? Like, yeah, if you're living under the threat of death and you're seeing people that you love and care about dying, then you do want to see a new heaven and a new earth, right? You want to see something different. So I think it's important, like as a clergy person, I think it's important to tell the congregation this kind of thing. And so one thing I always try to do whenever I'm preaching on Revelation is to be like, hey, look, everything you think you know about Revelation is probably wrong. We've let other people define what this is, and it's really not about the end times. It's not about like trying to figure out the exact day that the world's going to end. No, this is about someone living under oppression and trying to envision something else. So that's my take. Do you have Mark?
For me, bouncing off of what you're saying, exactly. It's important to remember that this is a text coming from someone who's being oppressed, and it's trying to sort of use secretive language to communicate important things about hope, essentially. And for me, one of the beautiful things about this particular text that Sharon has shared with us is I absolutely love this idea that the New Jerusalem comes from heaven and ends up on earth.
Yes,
like
yes.
It isn't up in the sky somewhere. Like there is this new present hope of what can be here and now. And it speaks of a marital relationship, of this partnership. And for me, that puts the onus on humanity of there is this possibility of something better and more beautiful, but it's work. It's like marriage. Marriage is work. It's, you've got to be committed to it. You got to be in partnership with the person you're with. And I love that this kind of brings that language to the idea of who we should be in relationship to creation, and that it is very much a here and now thing, and that it's a piece that's communicated from a place of needing and wanting to hope and be hopeful. I mean, Sharon, I know this is one of your favorite texts, so tell us about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was surprising because when I first encountered this text, particularly this passage, it was really shocking to me that it is not that escapist kind of literature that is surrounded about the text, right? So very often, and I'm sure you both know this, that when we actually sit down and read the text, it says something very different than what we've been told about the text, right? And so here you have, it is not about us going away to some, better place, but it is about bringing God in among us, right? So it's almost like saying, hey, prepare this earth and make it in a way that is, or take care of it in a way that we invite the divine among us. So to me, that is one thing that I've was an aha moment, right, when I read this text. The other thing, of course, is I agree exactly with what you said, Caleb, and I really want to come and sit in your congregation when you're preaching on Revelation. I'm just saying, okay. But when you say it, this is not a text as it seems. It is about oppression, and I do feel like John of Patmos gets it wrong, because he is so embedded in the language of the oppression and pushing back, that in a way he kind of creates these images that are also equally problematic, right? In the way he's duplicating a new empire, but this new empire, as most post-colonial theorists will say, is duplicated on a Roman imagery, right? But he just calls it something completely different. And it's a new way for us to understand the way in which, when we are resisting oppression or resisting imperial powers, how are we doing it? Because if we're using the same language and the same model and the same images as the old, all we end up doing is duplicating those oppressions here on earth. And so to me, that's why I think John of Patmos is very, very interesting, because he tells you, he's the classic example of how the systems of oppression are very powerful, and in the way in which we're embedded in, sometimes even the way we're duplicating things is unconscious, right?
Yeah, and that's such a great point on this particular topic matter, because when we look at that it's really an economy-driven issue of why we're
Yes.
destroying the planet. I mean, it is that we're not connected any the way we should be any longer. We don't understand it, but it's such an economy-driven, and it's driven by the powerful and governments that are connected to and benefit from them. So it's so important that what you just taught us there is so important to keep that in mind in this. And I'm going to use the word battle, because it is a fight for the life of the planet. To not adopt their language so much that it becomes a hindrance to us, but instead use more creative language, use language that works over and against, that communicates better and is more open to where we're trying to go, and that connectedness and that life-giving space rather than life-taking space, that the core top. I just blanked on the word, but the corporations and governments combined tend to take it to this more life-taking rather than life-giving. And I love your perspective on that.
And it hinders the conversation, right? Which is what Dr. Fox and Dr. Hermans Webster were talking about. Like, why can't we break through, or why can't we have conversation that is progressing it forward? And probably one of the reasons is because maybe we need to change the way we talk about it and change our language around this. Somebody in the chat even talked about this idea of us and them. Unfortunately, Revelation really plays off on that language, and so as long as we're still talking about us and them, or we're talking about the Trinity in three persons, and not talking about the interconnectedness or willing to see ourselves in the other, right? None of these topics, none of these issues will ever be solved.
You know, we
that's
keep
a
coming
great
back.
point.
Go
I
ahead,
was just
Caleb.
gonna say, I think that's a great point too, in terms of countering empire and stuff. And I think that's primarily what Jesus was trying to do, you know. And I think
Mm, yeah.
we get that wrong so much, because the language in the church is so like, oh, the kingdom of God is the kingdom of heaven, and it's something beyond us, right? It's something in the hereafter. Sweet by and by. And instead of thinking about something that Jesus was talking about creating over and against the Roman Empire as something that could kind of topple the Roman Empire, right? A loyalty and allegiance to something right now that we create, a system of peace and justice where everyone has enough, where there's economic equality, and where we're taking care of each other and taking care of all those things around us. And so I think in a lot of ways that if we're focusing on the kinds of teachings that Jesus had, and we're trying to understand those in their context, and not thinking that too is something otherworldly, but it's something that's grounded in the here and now, the reign of God, that if we're talking about that's something that can kind of overthrow those systems of oppression, just as Jesus wanted them to in that time, but also can change our loyalty so that maybe we're not serving the systems of capitalism and money and destruction in the here and now.
All right. And one of the important things to take off on what you just said, these systems of destruction, one of the things that's important, particularly if you're a follower of the teachings of Jesus, is to recognize that it's precisely the vulnerable populations of the world that bear the most brunt of this kind of raping of the planet. And partly because they have less power in terms of voice and being able to affect change, and so it's easier to put all of the nasty side effects that come out of this right in their neighborhoods, so to speak. And so even just from a standpoint of understanding, like you said, economic equality and the importance of the teachings of Jesus, we have to recognize that this is so much bigger than just, it's important to save the planet, which is a giant thing. But it's also saving each other and saving the vulnerable, or at least trying to help provide equality within a system that's just stacked against them completely.
That's a great point. And I think environmental racism is such an important thing to acknowledge, and something that I think that is still relatively new for a lot of folks. The recognition that environmental racism is a very real thing, but I mean, it has deep-seated history in our culture. I mean, if you want to talk about just even like taking native lands from folks, I mean, that's environmental racism. Or if you want to talk about how the reservations that we've stuck Native people on in the United States tend to be favorite toxic waste dumping sites, that's environmental racism. Or how we put hazardous chemical plants in predominantly communities of color. That's environmental racism.
Exactly.
That we see today. And so I think one of the things that is important for us, I think, when we're talking about people who maybe don't think a whole lot about climate change, or it seems abstract, is to help folks recognize that this is a justice issue that affects people too. It's not just some abstract thing in the future, or it's just that, the climate's changing a bit or whatever. This is something for future. It affects people in the here and now. And so I like Psalm 146 too for this, because in Psalm 146, we hear that God made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is within. And then it says, God executes justice for the oppressed, gives food to the hungry, and sets the prisoners free, right? So it connects like the creation of the universe with these concrete justice issues. And for me, whenever I read that for the first time, I'm like, even here, we recognize that the connection of nature with human beings is a real justice issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the connectedness is something I was wanting to get back to, because it seems like no matter what path we start heading down as we talk about creation and our responsibilities, we always end up talking about how we keep missing the point of connectedness. So my question is
Yes.
just a kind of a wide question of what
Yeah.
can we be doing to reinstate our connectedness and our understanding of our connection with creation, seeing all of creation as part of our family, and something
Right.
that we're that deeply connected with. What can we be doing in real life right now on the ground? What kind of things will help us connect with that?
Hmm.
I'm just curious if we have thoughts like, what do we need to be doing in our own communities to help us get back to that understanding? I mean, one, we can get outside of our houses. That's pretty simple. But
Right.
it's not just walking through the woods. It's like being present in the woods. And what do we
Right.
need to be doing so that we can? I think it's essential. The number of times that we've come back to that, a lot of this happens because we don't understand our connectedness with creation. So it's
Yes.
essential that we understand more fully, and not just understand as something bigger than words, that we experience our connectedness with creation. How do we get back to that?
I think even, with what you're saying, Mark, when we're talking about how do we experience connectedness, maybe one way is to kind of listen to the voices of the creation, right? Like
Mm,
it goes back to this idea of, when earth speaks, listen, right? And
yeah.
we don't.
Mm,
We have a tendency to speak over, or silence the voices, silence the signals, and like what is the earth, what is the creation saying back to us? So giving agency or giving voice back to the creation, rather than taking that away. So that's one
mm,
thing I would say, and that's helpful, right? Like thinking about where our food comes from. This
yeah.
is where you're giving the agency back. Thinking about the ways in which, you know our decisions of the environment particularly affect certain communities way more than it does other communities.
Mm,
Like recognizing that, we still just I'm just going to speak from being in the classroom. We still talk about biblical texts, but we talk about biblical texts in terms of, like women's issues and race and poverty, and that's great. But climate change is still something that we rarely touch upon in the classroom. So this is very important, especially when we're training people who are going out and being leaders in their communities, to really understand the lens of climate change while reading biblical text, right?
yeah.
And that should not just be upfront and center. That should be something that we're weaving through
Mm,
every topic, right? So we don't just do, let's like, this is something we love doing, right? Let's celebrate Earth Day. Like, no, it shouldn't be let's celebrate Earth Day. Earth Day should be woven throughout, and how do we make those?
yeah.
We have to keep making those connections till it becomes natural for us.
Mm,
That we're not coming in and saying, oh, now today's the day to make the connection. No, that connection should be being made every single day, and teaching all of us to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think I appreciate those practical steps too. I was thinking about in terms of what maybe churches ought to be doing and communities of faith ought to
mm,
be doing, and this ought to be a priority for communities of faith, because if you look at the research, because churches, especially mainline churches, are always concerned about church decline, like, the church is
Yeah.
dying. Well, the two most common reasons given for people leaving the church are the church's perceived stances on LGBTQ plus issues, right? That the
yep.
church is kind of a homophobic kind of
Yeah.
place,
Right.
and perceived stances on climate change, which
Yes.
is that the church doesn't care because they think the world ought to end. And
Right.
so we know that these are the two most common issues that are keeping people out of the church. So whenever I'm talking to a church that's like, well, what do we do to grow? I'm like, well, if I were you, I would talk
Right.
about these two issues a lot, because
Right.
we know that this is why people are leaving the church. So say, hey, this is not an impediment to you here. And I mean,
Yeah.
it's to be talking about why it is that we ought to be caring for the earth, because we know that climate change is the most pressing issue of our time. So I think if we are doing the same kind of thing in church, Sharon, that you were just talking about in academia, that if we're talking about why it is important, that's significant. But I think we also ought to be exploring partnerships with other organizations and being actively involved in kind of climate justice work. I think that is a different kind of connection, right? The maybe the one you were talking about, Mark, the like connection to nature, but it's connection to people. That is the same kind of work, the connection to people that promotes kind of climate justice. So I think if we're putting it in front of people a lot, and we're making those theological connections and talking about why it's important, I think that does a lot to help communicate that it's a theological issue to the people who are already in the pews. And I think it helps to get more people.
Well, and I think to your point of the church dying and how people aren't particularly talking about the environmental issues, you know, there actually is a small section of Christianity that's beginning to see some energy and growth. And some folks have labeled it the rewilding of Christianity. I know Brian McLaren talks about it. Our former executive director, Deshna Shine, talks about this as well. The rewilding of getting back to nature and our understanding our connectedness of that. A little plug for Progressive Christianity right here too. We have a children's curriculum out, and in the most recent one, year 3, there's actually a whole lesson on the rewilding. It's called A Joyful Path. I encourage you to go check us out there. But that is an area, is to your point exactly, Caleb, of we're seeing that the folks who have left institutionalized church are being attracted by churches that are getting back into the environment and really reconnecting with life in general. And one of the thoughts that I have is that, you know, when you look at the history of creation, creation holds a history of God that humanity itself could never hold. So why have we spent so much time running away from our connection with this? There is a much deeper story of God in creation than humanity could ever hold. We're missing so much just in learning that, and that's not surprising that people are wanting to get back to that and that it's significant.
Yeah, right. I mean, I agree. And it's so sad because, you know, when I used to teach undergrad, a lot of my undergrad students who had fallen away from the church would often say, if only our churches could speak about these topics in a more truthful, honest manner, we'd be there, right? Like, rather than, let's just keep harping or recycling things, and recycling not in a good way, right, but recycling old theologies and things like that. It's so problematic. But I think these are some really great topics to think about, just practical ways. Talking about LGBTQIA issues and climate justice. How are we training our leaders in the classroom? How are there resources out there for children? Which Mark, thank you for making that plug. Which we have in our own ProgressiveChristianity.org website. So please check that out. In addition to that, I think also just what we did today was just go back to the text and read it, and really read the text and see what the text is speaking to us, as opposed to thinking what we know about the text. And sometimes kind of doing this exegesis is fun, but also deeply important. Any last thoughts before we wrap up?
I wish that we could do a whole year on this. I think it's that important to not just humanity in general, but also just to spirituality. And we've allowed spirituality to head down a really unhealthy path in terms of how we relate to creation. And I think we've got to make a really hard turn back to it, and as quickly as possible. So that's just my quick little 2 cents on the importance of this topic.
My only other addition to what we've said is that one of the other practical things that we ought to be doing is working for legislative change, because while it is important to reform individual practices, the impacts of that tend to be minimal. And I think that that's something that faith communities can be involved in. They ought to, and that's one way to display your authenticity and your commitment to real environmental justice. And so I just, the last thing I will say is just, I like this quote from Marjorie Keenan that she put in the chat. Said, "God is the universe is God. God is in all, no separation."
Yes.
Yeah.
Love it. Love it. That's a great way. Thank you all for joining us today and listening to our conversation and contributing to our conversation with your wonderful comments. Just a quick reminder, next month's episode on Things That Matter will be on the 12th, and we will bring to you another, stimulating conversation on a topic that is relevant to us today, and then we will follow that up with a conversation that we had just like we did today. So thank you again for joining us. We are ProgressiveChristianity.org, and we're going to sign off, and we hope you have a wonderful day.